Are we on now?
Hi, Tzadik.
Hey, Tomo. So I'm going to just kind of maybe share a little bit with anyone who's watching. This is actually our first attempt at using this particular technology. We are actually on a Zoom cast call with each other, which is the normal mechanism that the Earthwalk global team uses for all of our team meetings. So Tomo, who is on the global council, lives in Florida, and I'm currently in Colorado, and we have team members all over the place. And this is the forum that we utilize. And we're in the middle of what would be called a chair-to-chair meeting. So meaning Tomo is the chair of the communications committee for the Global Earthwalk team. I'm the chair of the Global Core Council. We're having a chair-to-chair meeting to make sure that his team and my team are working well with each other, and if there's anything that needs to be worked through and sorted out so the entire organization can really function. And in this meeting, we started talking about just conversations around accountability and how do we build that within an organization whose basic principles are about love, peace, joy. So the conversation and when we were in the middle of that conversation, I asked Tomo, like, hey, is there, because we have so many amazing conversations in our Zoom calls, in our meetings. We would really love to be able to start sharing them with the world because I think there's a lot of really great gems. And so I turned to Tomo, our communications chair. I said, hey, way for us to live stream our conversations, some feedback from our global community as we're developing all these different systems. So it's not just our voices, but your voices too. So here we are. This is our first attempt at doing this. Is there anything you want to say before we jump in, Tomo?
Wubba lubba dub dub. No, I think that the conversations that we're having is really valuable. Not just for us organizationally, but also just from a practical standpoint. I mean, one of the hardest things about any kind of a relationship, right? And using the idea of relationship in like that broader spectrum, not just to mean like a physically intimate relationship, but rather just two people relating to each other, either professionally or personally. One of the hardest things to do, one of the most difficult things to do, is to be able to hold somebody accountable um, for that sense of fair play, for that sense of justice, because there's always this pushback of they might not like me, they might reject me, they might be offended, they might take me the wrong way, and with everything that we're wanting to kind of do, especially especially when it comes to organizationally as an organizational entity. We want to be able to kind of have these conversations and be able to hold people accountable so that way things can just move forward, so that way progress can be made, so that way people can be healed, so that way resolution can occur, so that way people can feel complete in a moment, so that way they can be present in that moment rather than constantly having to be reflect back on it in the past. And that is largely, I think, what we want to do. Like that's what the purposes of this conversation is, to figure out how we can actually do that to go ahead and get those mediums. And the fact that we're able to kind of broadcast it online for people to be able to see, for people to be able to participate in, and kind of put that input, I think is really reflective of kind of our organizational goal as a whole. We want this conversation to be had not just by us, but by everyone. So that way people can come to an agreement on how this can occur. And if it doesn't start with us just basically laying it all out on the line, putting it out in the open, potentially with gaffes and all, then it's just not us being human and being in integrity with us acknowledging that it's a difficult conversation, that there's going to be disagreement and that there's going to be contention, but that should not be a reason to not move forward. It's just an indicator, some evidence that the conversation is worth having.
Awesome. And what I'm thinking about is how this conversation began between us today is giving people who are watching this a little bit of history around or information on how Earthwalk works. Made a decision a little while ago to actually get rid of the term volunteers. We don't have volunteers. We have everyone who is a part of our global organization in service to the mission. And then the resources that are exchanged amongst and within all of the team members as a part of this global organization is figured out based on all sorts of calculations with regards to what people's needs are in relation to their roles and the tasks assigned and what have you. And within an integrative economic system, which is how we operate, is understanding that everyone is resourced differently. So for one person to be able to accomplish a certain task, $1 million to be able to do X, Y, and Z. Person might want to have 1 million hugs. And in a non-judgmental operation system, how to not to equate those as one being more valuable to the other, but actually listening to the heart of the matter and having a conversation. Part of the process we have with Earthwalk is what we call sacred contract processes, and in that we have these aligned conversations. Like, what is it that you need to feel resourced to accomplish that we've set out and that he's agreed to say yes to? And so instead of it being this utter experience, which we currently live in worldwide, it's really asking the question of what's the tasks at hand, who are you as an individual, and what do you need or your team need to be able to accomplish those agreed upon goals in a way that you feel fed, you feel nourished, and not only that, but you're thriving, alive, joyful. You're actually living the whole mission and vision of Earthwalk, which is to create a reality based in peace, love, and joy. In knowing that as our infrastructure, that a lot of the models that we have today in working environments, if someone is hired by a team, there's a contract normally where you do said task. If you don't do said task, then we're either not going to pay you or we're going to penalize you or what have you. And that's how a lot of the operating systems work within our planet. And so when we ask the question, if we're creating a world that's love-based, a world of peace, we infect the world with love. So if that is our notion of the pathway to peace, how do we then create accountability systems, our framework within Earthwalk, model that to the rest of the world, come comes from a place of love as opposed to fear. So if you think about the punitive model of if you don't do this, you're not going to get this, or you're going to get, if you don't do said task, we'll fire you, so you'll continue to get that. How do we shift that from that conversation, which so many of us are so familiar with, whole systems model? So you might know like restorative circles, restorative justice. Shift it to restorative systems, to a whole systems model where instead of punishing people for not accomplishing certain things or not showing up in a certain way or what have you, how do we actually shift the conversation to love-based accountability? And what I want to be transparent with is we're not saying we have the answer. We're actually inviting you into a conversation that we're having here right now in the aftermath of dealing with a lot of accountability issues like on our team. And when we're not, so when we're operating within a different model, which is not about accountability through payment, basically, what I'll even call on some level, has notions of a slavery system, but when it's actually calling people to the table to do their heart's song, to do their heart's calling, what happens when people break agreements, violate agreements that we've made as a collective field, do that in a way that is love-based? And here's that conversation. We're just beginning it now.
We're going to solve it all right now.
Hey, Pinky, what are you doing? How's it go?
Gee, Bright, what we gonna do tonight? Same thing we do every night, Pinky. Try to take over the world.
So yeah, so the question is like, if, within Earthwalk, a lot of what we speak to is, in order to create a world of peace, well, we need to create a culture of peace within our organization. And as a part of the values and principles that we talk about within Earthwalk, in order to create that is if I say to you, I'm going to do something, and I don't do it, that's going to create a certain energetic. It's going to affect the dynamic. It's going to affect the relationship. And if we boil down the whole conversation of world peace, it's all about relationships. It's massive conversation of infinite relationships. So how do we bring the same level of, let's say, what's happening between two people, agreements, broken, not broken, behavior that works for one or doesn't work for another? How do we navigate all of that stuff with care? And so within that, as a part of that, what we talk about within Earthwalk is making agreements with each other as a part of our team are very important. We hold that to a very high level, because if we're trying to model creating a world of peace, but yet we're not modeling part of the ingredients that create that, which is fulfilling our agreements, and or if we can't fulfill our agreements, having the conscious conversations to switch and shift the agreements. How do we do that within our culture to model that for a larger scale? So within the field of agreements, how do we, let's say, someone I don't know, do you want to make up an example, Tomo? Like, let's say
So yeah, we can take something pretty colloquial, like just a friendship. Like, right, you've got a friend. Hey, I borrowed a video game from you because you said I could, and I said I would return it in a week, and that didn't happen, right? So I held on to the video game for 2 months, right? That's if you're really very particular about your video games, or what your belonging is, that can be a very definitely a source of mistrust, of frustration, anger, all of it. And it's nice and simple. It's, hey, I lent this to you. You said you'd give it back to me in a week, and you didn't. How do you hold your friend accountable? And for me, for me, the way that I frame it is in terms of consequences, and just paying awareness to the negative connotation that the phrase consequences can have. Um, uh, think of it more as like in the term of physics: for every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction, right? Um, I always tend to try to break things that are, even if they're very emotional, down to very um, mechanistic type of principles. And the same is true for relationships. Relationships kind of have this same kind of physics type of interaction. When something doesn't occur, something will happen in that relationship. So, in terms of the video game example, when uh, I borrowed the game from Tzadik, right? Um, and Sadiq was expecting me to turn it back into a week. He's really serious about this game. It's one of his favorite games, and it's like super important. And I promised him that I would give this game back to him. How he would hold me accountable would begin with consequences. The consequences for my actions of not being in integrity to the promise that I made. What does that look like? Because there is reasonable consequences when you demonstrate in a particular situation that your word should not be taken to be as solid as the ground that you walk on. And obviously, there's conversations about maybe I didn't realize it was a week. Maybe I didn't realize that Sadiq really meant a week, and I thought he wasn't really actually being serious. Whatever the reasons are behind all of that, all that stuff needs to be addressed and navigated. But by approaching it from the specifics of the consequences for saying, hey, look, this is what the situation was, and this is the result that it has for me. What can we do about it to make sure that the situation never arises again? It takes away all of the emotional triggers for blaming, saying, hey, you promised me, what, were you trying to piss me off? That you know how important this game is to me, that you're going to go ahead and treat my belongings with such crap and such disregard. How dare you do that to me? And then, I didn't do anything to you, dude. I didn't realize you were going to spaz out. Like, that conversation doesn't need to happen if it's, hey, I'm sure you didn't intend to break your promise to me, but I took you seriously when you said that you would return this in a week and you haven't, and I would not want to be in a position to not trust you with my belongings again. So I'd like to understand what happened here and what we can do to make sure that um, I feel like I'm not misplacing my trust. When you tell me something, I want to be able to believe it.
Yeah, what's coming alive for me, like as you're speaking, is, if we're to create polarities of models here, the punitive justice system and the restorative justice system, or the separation model, us and them, versus whole systems model. And so in the punitive model, what does normally happen? We punish someone for doing bad behavior. We send them to jail. We do this, we do that.
Roll up the newspaper, hit the dog on the nose.
Right. And within a whole systems model, very much like what you're talking about, is we look at, like, what's at play? What's going on? Is there misunderstanding happening? Or is there not misunderstanding happening, but maybe there are issues around follow through with an individual or accountability or what have you. But within the different orientations, one is about placing blame and fault, and the other is about creating solutions and creating restoration.
On the nose, exactly.
To actually restore. And so the thought that comes alive for me in this conversation is, okay, like, let's say I promised to do something. I didn't do it. There's an impact on the team as a result. We have assess the impact. We talk about it. Everyone gets a chance to like chime in and put their feelings in. So we have a full understanding of the impact. And then from that impact, and this kind of goes to the conversation we were having before we videotaped, from my perspective, there's two pieces. There's one, how do we get back into integrity with the original agreement? So if I said I was going to do X, Y, and Z, fulfill that being completed, whether that's by me or by someone else or by a group of other people. So how do we fulfill the initial agreement? And assessing any potential, any damage that occurred, what happened to restore the system so everyone feels whole again. Right. Not about placing blame, but really like, you know, maybe going around in a circle, if you will, and saying, you know, is there anyone that feels that they need to take responsibility in all this? And what actions might come out of that responsibility? Like, what are the ways to restore the field to a whole model? Because typically what happens, agreements are broken, happens is there's a hole in the field. And that hole that I was referring to before, HOLE, as opposed to WHOLE. And so, you know, going like losing the W, if you will. There's got to be a metaphor in there somewhere. Right. Look at it. You know, but like what? So there's a hole that's created in the field, in the organizational structure, in the relational dynamic. And so how do we restore ourselves to a space of wholeness, to a place of love, a place of joy? So one, we can get back to business. We can get back to what we all came here to set ourselves out to do. And what's the process for that? You know, because I look at, like, I know some of the men's circles that I've sat in. When a man comes to a circle and is out of integrity with their agreements, one of the processes that we typically do in those circles is we invite the man to take a look at, you know, what the impact was. And actually, I would say actually, this particular men's group, they don't do that much of focusing on the impact. I think the piece that I'm adding in here, but they do invite the man to do a makeup, to do an amends. I think there's a missing piece in there, and that is piece, which is like, what's the impact? You know, right. And do I have responsibility in the impact? Because some of the impact could be like, you know, another team member says, you know what, I need to communicate with you better, or whatever the thing is. Like, there can be collective responsibility. When we get clear with what we truly feel is our own responsibility, what are the actions necessary to take to restore the field, at least from, you know, my seat? And so then, and I'm just going to finish this thought really quickly. So in that, we would invite them to say that, and then in that model, I'm trying to remember, because this is 2 circles back that we did this. We don't process in the circle that I'm in now, but in that circle, I believe there was a process of whether or not the men accepted or not. Mm-hmm. Which I kind of like that model, because again, we're talking about restoring whole systems. So if there's a piece where people still don't feel whole, the goal is to get to that place of wholeness. Right. Yeah.
Yeah. Now, and that last piece that you're bringing in, that was the thing that was percolating in my brain, was that there's inevitably, when you're having these discussions, there's going to be circumstances where, you know, the party A is not going to acknowledge that what parties B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I, J, K, L have been experiencing, right, as part of the impact. Like, there's that question of, is the impact actually real, or is this just them being oversensitive, or is this their issue, or is this, you know, and whatever the reason is, there's inevitably going to be some kind of, there needs to be that space of, if the person is not going to accept that the impact is real, then there has to be a step in there for demonstrating that the impact is real, right? For us to get, for that agreement to be had, because without the agreement, the entire process stalls. Even if somebody's willing to go through the motions, right? That's not actually them really feeling like they're being healed and they're being heard and that the process is being fair for them, because they're going through the motions. They're doing what they're supposed to do, right? And that just validates everything that they're saying and making them feel like they're they're the wronged party that's being bullied in an unjust system because of X, Y, or Z. So there has to be that agreement, because without that agreement, then there's no action that can actually be planned. People then just have to agree to disagree, which is also just basically putting off the problem to have to be solved later. Because if it's a problem then, it's just going to be a problem later. So, so for example, I had a situation with somebody who I will not name, but where I was concerned for them and their behavior. And they disagreed with me that their behavior was a problem. And so what the agreement that we came to was, all right, well, I think it's a problem and you don't. I think that it's reasonable to say that we need to figure out if it is a problem or not, because we disagreed. So, the solution, the solution in that instance was simply to, every single time that the behavior occurred, that they take responsibility to mark it on a calendar, right? And that provided a visual, right? That created a situation where all of a sudden they were being confronted with what their own behavior was. They were marking it down. And so then the discussion later on was, okay, is this normal? Is this kind of frequency normal? Or is this frequency not normal? What is the number of times it's occurring? Wouldn't you agree, if this situation keeps on occurring, that it would be better if this situation occurred less? Because look at all the problems that is occurring, right? So again, it's not about blame. It's about it's about acknowledging a problem. It's about coming up with the solutions. It's about acknowledging that the solution exists. And then from there, it's what can we do to help solve this problem? Because it's unreasonable to expect that the pattern behavior that you're very comfortable with, and that has been perfectly reasonable for you for the entirety of your life, should suddenly be switched all by you in a vacuum based off of your own efforts within a week or a month or even a year. I mean, we're talking about, we're especially like as an organization, we're talking about adults, right? It's not like we've got 5-year-olds going ahead and trying to be part of the finance or membership chairs, right? We're talking about people who have jobs, who have kids. These are people who have patterns in their life that have worked for them. They're still alive. That works, right? So in that particular context, it becomes even more important to go ahead and say, look, you can't possibly do this yourself. It would be unfair and unreasonable for us to do that. However, we are here to help you. You're not alone. And this is something that you agree would be, your life would be better if this situation was different in that particular way. So this is one of the solutions that we can provide on how to help you with this thing that's causing a problem in your life. Because it's not causing a problem in our lives, because we don't have this particular problem. And so, like, I love that idea of that kind of accountability about, and making sure that they're acknowledging. And if they're not acknowledging, at least then we have a step, right? Okay, that's what you're saying. It's not a problem. Let's explore this.
Right, because it's not about, peace is not passivity. There's a common adage in the peace movement that says, no justice, no peace.
Right.
We haven't restored the system. We haven't healed the wounds. We haven't addressed there will be no peace. It's critical, it's essential. And so, in a lot of new age movements, different communities, I think there's this term called like spiritual bypassing, where a lot of the issues aren't actually addressed. Everyone's kind of like, just nice and pretty,
Right.
rather than actually having the courage and the strength to compassionately talk about what issues are going on. Ouch, that hurt. I didn't like that. And to actually be willing to be vulnerable with your heart, which again is the love-based approach, to be able to be vulnerable with your heart and how the world affects you and how you affect it. It takes a lot of courage. And we don't have too many models out there.
No.
And, it's really challenging because I know for me, part of my experience, because I love these types of conversations, as you know.
Right.
And accountability, integrity is something that's really important to me. It's major for me. And as I said, no justice, no peace. You can't build a global organization with a mission to create a world of peace without systems of accountability. It's just not possible. A body without a healthy immune system dies. Bottom line. And so how do we create systems, checks, and balances that allow for all the voices to be heard in a compassionate way, not where it's focused on who's to blame, actually like how do we restore the system? How do we heal? Like heal and whole, it's the same actual root. If you look in the etymology, healing and wholeness are the same. Holistic, healing, whole, it's all the same root from A-well. And so in making that shift, though, the other thought though, that comes to my mind is there are going to be times where, like you were alluding to the fact, where some people just don't see it. Mm-hmm. They don't see their impact, or they see their impact, but they don't fully grok.
Right.
So they understand that they spilled milk, but they don't understand the process of cleaning up spilled milk.
Right. I cleaned it. What do you want? I looked at it. I acknowledged it. It's the thought that counts. What more do you want from me?
Right. For some people, it's like they acknowledged it and that's it. That's the end of the process. But there's still spilled milk there. And there's a dynamic there between that's like more of a parent-child relationship,
right,
as opposed to a coming together of equals. And so when you have a coming together of equals, from my perspective, is you have someone's like, oh, whoops, I spilled the milk. That was and I acknowledge, oh yeah, I did that. That was my fault. Acknowledge the sorry, and then either go to pick it up or say, you know what, I don't have enough time to pick it up myself right now. Would you be willing to help me? Or, hey, I can't do it right now. Can you do it this time? And next time there's a spill, I'll pick up for you. Like whatever that is, it doesn't always have to be like spilling milk. The process must be about picking it up yourself, but it's about taking accountability and allowing the whole system to work for the issue that's occurred and allowing for wholeness to be restored. But that brings in that question of like, well, what happens when someone is unable to recognize their actions and their impact? And because this, hold with me for a moment in that ultimately, from my perspective, when someone is in a certain operational field and they're not able to see their impact, and there's no convincing around their impact, in some scenarios, from my perspective, sometimes the only solution to bring wholeness back to that container is to ask that person to step off. Or to say like, hey, these are collective agreements. If you can't meet this, we're going to ask you to step off because we've made this collective agreement and it appears as if you're not wanting to meet in the agreement field of this particular container. And maybe it's time for you to go to another container that has a different agreement field that works for you. So like how to navigate that space, because a lot of people would experience that as rejection or experience that as not enough, as opposed to simply it's just operational agreements. It's what a particular group decides is their collective agreements to maintain peace within their status. Like how does one navigate something like that in a love-based accountability culture without doing the best that system could to not evoke shame, to not evoke blame, but to still come to the equation with clear eyes?
So I love that you brought up that point, because it's a really important point and actually really dovetails on a thought I had, where how what we agree to and holding people accountable largely depends upon the boundaries that we establish. Because if you do not establish consistent boundaries, you're hurting somebody. You're actually setting them up for failure. I have a saying that I love to go back to, which is boundaries are a gift that you give other people. Clear and consistent boundaries are a wonderful gift that you give other people, because they remove the uncertainty of that people have when dealing with people. Because everybody's got different thresholds, right? Like some people, if you spill the milk, they'd be like, oh, whatever, the dog will get it, right? And that's fine. Not a big deal. For somebody else, you spilled the milk, I have to strip the linoleum and burn the house down. Like it's and these varying thresholds have a really big impact on how people can really relate to each other. So I honestly think that while sometimes certain situations, because of the time necessary to be able to address them and the agreement needed to be able to address them, um, do need to result in them finding another space, right? That just needs to happen. That's really a byproduct of of their unwillingness to work through a process which is a specific boundary for the organization. And as
Right.
long as we're clear and consistent in pointing out those boundaries every single moment at every single opportunity, then what we are doing is we are setting other people up for failure. We really are, because every single time that you let something slide, if you're the person that needs to burn down the house when the milk is spilled, and you don't say anything to the person that spilled the milk and was like, "Don't worry, the dog will get it. Not a big deal," right? And you don't say anything, right? Even if you only say stuff once every 5 times or once every 3 times, you're not being consistent, and that person reasonably has all of these experiences of you not saying anything, right? So they have that, like literally, they have reason. They are being reasonable. No matter how extreme your reaction is, the other 7 out of 10 times, as far as they're concerned, they have all of these experiences, right? Like people sometimes don't remember things the same way. They don't experience things the same way because their focus is on something else entirely. So they're only going to remember that. If we know that people are only going to remember things the way that they're going to remember them, when we do not consistently, unilaterally, every single time, inexhaustibly outline the boundaries of those outline our boundaries and confirm that they are reasonable and fair every single time. If we don't do it every single time, then what we're doing is we're creating opportunities for that misunderstanding to grow and be considered reasonable. And that's not just true for the individual, it's true for every single person that's connected to those incidents, because then they go, oh, well, Bob spilled milk and you didn't go ahead and blow up on him. Oh, well, Steve spilled milk and you didn't blow up on him. Oh, Jenny spilled milk and you didn't blow up on her, right? Like, so it has an exponential effect on the rest of the network that's there. So I think that in order for us to be able to create that environment where we're saying, hey, this is what our boundary is, these are what our agreements are, everybody thinks that they're fair and reasonable, we have to be inexhaustible. We have to be tireless in our efforts to do that, because otherwise, it's you create one scenario here where this person can do it, and then that person can do it, and then that kind of person can do it, and then when you have an organization in the thousands or the millions, hell, even in the hundreds or the 20s or the 30s, there's going to be a few people that do that, and then that behavior takes root, and it spreads, and it gets worse, and it gets worse, and it gets worse, because things are inconsistent. Nobody decides to walk off of a cliff without knowing what the results are going to be. Why? Because the law of gravity is tireless in promoting the consequences for when you defy its boundaries. Gravity says if you don't want to fall, you don't leave the ground. And it enforces that every single time. There's no arguments about gravity. There's no discussions. There's no reasons to believe that gravity is being unfair. There is no favoritism with gravity. It just is. It's a force of nature. And that really should be what our boundaries are. They should be forces of nature that are tireless and consistent, so that way they form a solid bedrock that people can feel safe walking on. Even if they're extreme, even if somebody's like, well, I'd really rather not have to have that conversation, right? Maybe they consider the conscious communication punitive in its own way, because they're just not comfortable with that connection. It's not like we misled them. It's not like they had reason to believe that it was going to be anything but that, because it's a force of nature. It's been consistent.
Right, and what's coming to my mind, and then I think we should probably wrap this up because just looking at the time.
Yes.
But what's coming to my mind is the conversations that I've been having with Jeff Tam from Woven Lightning, that a good friend of mine and also a partner to Earthwalk through his business, Woven Lightning. And the class, like the processes that we're talking about, is like there are going to be points where people cannot, they don't have the capacity to reach beyond a particular level of ability or skill set that would allow them to take that level of accountability. And so part of what we're looking at are classes, or like what we're calling integrative educational sessions. We're actually teaching about emotional intelligence, about how to be present to the emotions that are showing up. A lot of times people don't take accountability for things, not because they can't, but because they don't want to face the shame that's present, the anger that's present, or they don't want to face the fear that's present. So it's actually not about them not being able to take accountability for the action itself.
Right.
Actually face the stories related to the emotions that are arising is sometimes the most difficult thing for people to do. And so one of the things that we're putting into place right now within Earthwalk is all different mechanisms as far as soul coaching, the soul review sessions and stuff to invite people to talk about the issues that are present. But I'm also thinking is like, come to real blocks. Through that process, people get clear. They can't even engage in that conversation until they look at X, Y, and Z trauma, which is usually the case. Until they look at that trauma and heal that trauma, they can't even be present to that conversation of accountability this because it's like asking them to run a race when they got a broken knee.
Right.
And so how do we as an organization create without like, this is very tricky, you know,
Right.
like without shame, but like, hey, it looks like you might have a hurt knee there.
Right.
Like, would you be interested in this balm or like this treatment that might bring your knee back to a state of wellness so you can participate in this? Of course, you can't, you know, the whole adage, as far as you take a horse to water, you can't make him drink.
Right.
And then, you know, that of course will happen too. Like there will be people who you provide all the mechanisms for healing to in front of them, and ultimately they just are feeling incapable. And usually in that case, it's because the issue is so deep.
Right.
That, you know, we were talking about this the other day. You know, like the issue is so deep that there's no way in hell that they would even fathom facing that issue if they knew they had like infinite resource, or at least the right amount of resource.
Right.
So how do you create scenarios where as people start facing the bigger and bigger issues or the deeper and deeper issues, create the right mechanisms for transformation that can occur, so then they're actually capable to come back to the conversation with care.
Right. Yeah, and I think I come back to metrics on that. So like I'll share a personal story of uh my relationship with Sophie, and this is me being the bad guy in this kind of scenario. I'd grown up, I'd grown up a bachelor in my own space, so I was used to the way I did laundry was the dirty clothes were the ones that were on the floor, the clean ones were the ones that were on the bed, and never the twain shall meet. And this is a system that worked out gloriously for me just for a very long time. You know, I'm 36 years old. And I've been taking care of myself since I was like 17. So just quite a bit number of years before I'd been with Sophie that I've just been doing that. It's just been a long habit, and that can go back to my mom, and she's being a neat freak, and I thought it was unfair, and always hated to do that stuff, so I hated to do chores, et cetera, et cetera. So I just had a lot of issue regarding this is my space, this is my control, this is the way that I do things, and that's what's right, and that's what's appropriate. And Sophie came from a family where her family are dry cleaners. They take care of clothes. She was in a relationship with me. She wanted to show, how much she cared about me. So she was living with me by that time, and she was picking up my clothes, and she was just frustrated that they never seemed to make it in a hamper. They made it everywhere else, but they never made it in the hamper that was like literally like, dirty underwear, dirty t-shirt on the floor next to the hamper, not in the hamper, not even on the hamper, just right next to it, mocking, right? And I had tried to curtail. I had already seen that conversation happening where she was going to go ahead and say, well, I want you to go ahead and do that. And for whatever reason, I had this thing where, my house, my control, it's my space. I don't want to be dictated. So I told her, before you ever have this conversation with me about my clothes, A, you never have to do the laundry. B, I will hire a housekeeper because I never want to have an argument about housekeeping stuff. Just don't want to do it. So if you want to do this stuff because of X, Y, and Z, that's fantastic. I appreciate it, but you can't hold it over my head, right? So I was already putting up walls and blocks to deflect and move away from having to put my dirty clothes in a basket next to the floor where I would let it lay, right? And so this ended up resulting in arguments and discussions, and it was really unpleasant, and it was over something really silly. And after a while, it occurred to me, like, really, what is she asking here? She is. It took me having to agree that what she was asking was really not unreasonable, and why the hell wouldn't I do it? And I realized that a lot of it was just unconscious. I just years of habit, didn't realize I was doing it in those moments. Not like I was being like, fuck you, Sophie. There it is on the floor. I know you're gonna go ahead and hate it later. And it was also important for her to have a clean space just to be in because she was with me, right? So there was all of these really good reasons to actually acquiesce to her request. And there was all and so what we ended up doing was I asked her for help. I said, hey, look, I realized there's a couple of things here. I don't want to be blamed and treated like I'm a dick just because this is happening. I get this is unpleasant and everything that you're asking is fair, but because it's fair should not be a reason for you to attack me and not use this attacking language, because obviously she was so frustrated, she was expressing that reasonably so. I mean, if I could realize back then what I understand now, it's just idiotic that she was having to go ahead and put up with this ridiculous situation regarding dirty clothes, right? All I had to do was put it in a basket, and somebody was going to be taking care of my clothes, folding them, and putting them away for me. That's amazing. That's wonderful. There should not have been that much pushback. But in realizing that because I accepted it, and because I was able to frame it in a way where I was taking responsibility for what I was doing and not accepting the negative parts, like all of the stuff that was obviously triggering me about when she would yell at me about the housekeeping stuff, essentially, that was triggering me from, stuff that happened with my mom and all of that other stuff. Like, because I was able to have a conversation with her and say, hey, let's have, this is the help I need. This is the help I need. Then please help me with it. And it was just a matter of her saying, hey, babe, look, you left your socks on the floor. Doesn't need to go in the basket. Please, right? Just asking me nicely. And then I did it. So years later now, we're together. It took time. It took a while. But now, my clothes make it in the basket. So I think that even in those situations, if we start with the metric, because for me, I instituted the metric myself, but if she had instituted the metric for me, if she had said, look, let's go ahead and list out the ways that you're impacted by not putting the clothes in the basket, and let's look at the ways that I'm impacted by putting the clothes in the basket. Is this an equitable exchange? Is this a situation that you're comfortable with and dealing with somebody that you care about? Right? If she would have done those things, then that situation would have been great, and I would have been able to move past that. So, yeah, I think that wraps this up. I love you, brother.
We're laughing because I wrote him a note about a minute ago. I'm like, I gotta go to the bathroom. And he keeps talking. I'm like, no, seriously, I really gotta go. So with that, boundaries and full circle and taking care of these beautiful vessels that we each have, to walk upon this earth. Leaving the question, how do we create love-based accountability systems, and how do we create love-based communities? And would love your feedback. It's been fun, Tomo, and I'm going to run.
You do that, brother. I'll talk to you soon. And thanks, everyone, for listening. We're looking forward to your comments.